Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Some technical difficulties. So, the current talk, which Professor Stekeler-Weithofer is going to begin, concerns his immense work on the so-called reality of the fields, which provides an analysis of the basic categories of pre-deploy and thinking about mentioned stereo. Before we start, let me briefly introduce our today's guest. For those who do not know him, Professor Pirmin Stekeler-Weithofer has held the chair for theoretical philosophy at the University of Leipzig since 1992, and since 2019 he is a senior professor at the same university. He had been the president of the Wittgenstein Society from 2006 to 2009, and then had held the position of the vice president of the same society until 2021. He also had been the vice president of the Gadamer's and Wagner's Hegel until 2017, and from 2008 to 2015, he was the president of the Academy of the Sciences in Saxony, Germany. So, first and foremost, he is known for his immense contribution to Hegel studies, as well as his developments within many fields of philosophical investigations, which were inspired by Hegelian works. And distinctive mark of his approach is that it was conducted, or is conducted, within the analytic tradition. And his contribution has been made to such areas of philosophical investigation as philosophy of language, theory of consciousness and thinking, philosophy of mathematics, theory of actions, and so on. So, Professor Stekeler-Weithofer, we're very much excited to have you here, and want to thank you for giving your talk. And now I give the word to you.
Denis, thank you. Доброе утро. Before I start, I have to introduce myself a little bit more, because else it's difficult to understand what I want to present to you today. The point is the following. I have, in the last years, worked hard and written quite a lot of papers, almost 8,000 pages, on this man I want to talk today, namely Hegel. And the question is, how did I come to this task, and what is the reason that I'm interested in this man? The first, of course, answer is that I found that he is the most important philosopher of the 19th century, but that did not an idea I had when I started. I started, namely, in Constance, not as a philosopher so much, than as a mathematician, logician, linguist, and I did also literature. So my teachers, for example, in Constance were Joja Bar Hillel, or in Berkeley, Quine and Searle and Lakoff. People you might know, like Noam Chomsky also, and David Lewis. So how come that a person who was educated, who had the chance to be educated in this field, took an interest in Hegel? Well, the point was that some of my colleagues in Constance, Thomas Lynch and Menke, they asked me to help them to understand Hegel's logic. And I said, well, sometimes I will do it. However, it turned out that it's absolutely difficult to understand this piece of work. And so after some time, I said, I don't understand that man. After I learned, however, that Hegel developed the high school system together with Emanuel Niethammer in Nuremberg and improved it by introducing better mathematics, physics, chemistry into the German high school system. The modern high school all over the world was influenced by these two people. And after I learned that Hegel kicked out the mathematician in Nuremberg and taught mathematics himself, I got curious what that man was doing when he writes things in the logic of being about mathematics. So I started as a mathematician, as a logician, if you want, and looked at Hegel's philosophy of logic in the early times of 88, 89. And there I realized that if I were in those times and I would have been looking for a teacher of mathematics, I'm absolutely sure that there was no better teacher of mathematics than Hegel. The reason was that I realized that he understood what most people in mathematics today do not understand, namely what abstraction and ideation is, and what it is to talk about abstract entities. So that was the background that led me to look at Hegel, and so I came, in fact, from philosophy of mathematics. And for that reason, I just found this very important motto for today's talk, namely, logic consists in a total abstraction of all material subject matter, and philosophy is in its inner spirit logic. This citation stems from Fichte, and it's significant, especially because, as you know, Hegel wanted to be buried next to Fichte, and indeed he is, as you know. And I think this was a statement. It was a statement that Fichte was the first to renew philosophy, not so much Kant, even though he baptized his son Immanuel, but not in favor of Kant, but in favor of Emanuel Niethammer, his close friend in Munich. Okay, that is the background. And now I want to present you, at least as far as it's possible in such a short time, some ideas why I think that it's worthwhile to look in a new way on Hegel's philosophy. Okay, so this small difference of how to read the title of Hegel's Encyclopaedia of Philosophical Sciences makes a big difference, especially when it comes to the question how philosophy relates to the sciences. Because in my reading, I repeat, Hegel doesn't want to produce a system of philosophy, but a system of the sciences. And he wants to comment it in terms which he labeled speculative, but I would label it, in order to understand it better, logical geography, borrowing an idea of Gilbert Ryle. So the need for a systematic ordering of the sciences in those days resulted from the development of the sciences itself. And on the one side, on the other side, on a problem which is still mirrored in the English language, because it even canonizes a mistake. Since science, scientia, means now only natural, technical, and statistical sciences, which I consider only as a first group of disciplines that develop scientific knowledge. Long before Wilhelm Dilthey, Hegel speaks of the second group of sciences, the sciences of spirit, Wissenschaft des Geistes, Geisteswissenschaft in Dilthey. This second group of sciences, if understood properly and put into a system of sub-disciplines and subtopics, surpasses by far the themes and methods of the merely philological and historical humanities, as the English language has it today. They include all the social and political sciences, evolutionary or phylogenetic anthropology, ontogenetic or educational psychology, and so on. The third group of the sciences is what Carnap later calls Formalwissenschaften. They are the topic of Hegel's Science of Logic. We should read this work, 3-volumed work, as a first general semantics in history. It sketches the whole of the formal sciences, which goes far beyond mathematical logic, as Frege will develop it, and mathematics, which is Hegel's topic under the label of pure quantities, and which brought me into Hegel's philosophy, because that was his philosophy of mathematics. Not many people even know that, because they do not understand what quantities are. So it is nothing, in my opinion, than mere modern Pythagoreanism to assume with Kant and Novalis and other pious followers of Newton that true sciences are only mathematical in its form. So that is one of the major arguments of Hegel's all over of philosophy of the sciences, to say that if we mix up mathematical theories with the full knowledge of nature and the world, we are only still in the childhood of science and the childhood of philosophy, as he sarcastically says. So as I already have said, we must dismiss the hearsay that speculation in Hegel means the same as the word developed in later times. In later times, speculation is if I bet on making money by some money bets. Speculation in Hegel's sense is nothing but logical geography. The very notions of science and nature have become deeply ambivalent in the development of the languages and sciences, starting already in the 17th century. If we identify nature with the whole world, the problem of such a naturalism is that it has no serious opponent anymore. Every topic and all knowledge refers to nature, that is the world. Such a naturalism would be an extremely boring truism. So we see that Hegel has a problem in the way, for example, Spinoza talks about nature, because he uses the word as broad as the word world. So we need reconstruction of the contrast, not only between natural sciences and the sciences of spirit, but also between nature and spirit. Nature is the domain of all matters and processes that exist without any influence of human practices and actions. This is a very easy definition, and it helps a lot, and we need it. Moreover, Hegel rearranges the traditional distinction between the finitude of merely empirical cognition and what I call generic knowledge. And this generic knowledge is the same as semantic knowledge. So he rearranges it in a way which not many people understand today. The point is that empirical statements are of the form, there was a rabbit there, where the there makes clear that we have an implicit reference to a speaker, and therefore it's subjective. Whereas a statement like water is H2O belongs to episteme, to standing sentences of knowledge which we can learn by heart and which are independent of the speaker. They can be written in books and we can learn it and use it. And here I would say that such sentences are rules. They are rules which we use when we speak in practices. They are not used in normal speech. So they belong to language in the sense of langage and not to language in the sense of parole, in the way we speak. Historical knowledge is empirical, but standing sentences of the sciences is not empirical at all. In no science, we only say what somebody has seen or what somebody had perceived. And this is very important because it means that we have to understand the standing sentences as semantical rules which allow us to infer something contentful from what was said. So they are these standing sentences, which we have learned from childhood onwards. They are the differential, inferential forms which give our words meaning. They are the synthetic a priori knowledge Kant had talked about, but not realized how far or how huge that realm of synthetic a priori sentences is. For those who think, like Jürgen Habermas, that not Hegel, but the young Hegelians have overcome Hegel's allegedly mystical philosophy of spirit and concept, it may be helpful to remember that even Karl Marx declares that Hegel's philosophy of right marks the summit of critical social theory, as Konrad Lindner had pointed out recently. So my first title, my first section, Transforming Kant's a priori into Presupposed Conceptual Rules, now is already well prepared because it's almost clear what's going on. The basic idea of Hegel is that not philosophy, but the sciences develop the concept. Philosophy only reflects speculatively on these concepts. The problem is, of course, to understand what that notion of concept is. So Hegel's concept as such, Begriff an sich, is Plato's eidos. This word refers to any ideal structure, like those of arithmetic, geometry, Cartesian kinematics, Newton's mechanics, but also of modern chemistry and electrodynamics. Other topics are those of the political and social sciences, medicine, psychology, and so on. Hence, number, the words and the topics, science, law, state, and so on, are concepts in the sense of generic labels for whole domains of matters. And Hegel has a better ear to German and to all languages, from Hebrew to Latin and Greek, when he explains things. We usually do not call mere predicates like being a prime number or being a dog concepts, despite of the way Kant, Frege, or Russell speak. They think a concept is a predicate, but a concept is a structured genus, a whole domain. We arrive at the relevant genus from a mere predicate P, like being a prime number, by the union with its determinate negation non-P, for example, being not a prime number. Of course, we have to stick to the finite negation, as Hegel says, to the determinate negation, because we have to kick out sentences like Caesar is no prime number, or another example of Hegel, spirit is no elephant. So only when we have determinate negation, we come from a predicate to the genus. And if we do not know the topic, the genus, we will never understand what a person talks about. So the first thing in understanding a word is to look for the genus. It's to look for the concept, as Hegel says. And this is just the relational structure in which the differentiations the people talk about are defined. And if we do not find this overall genus, we will never understand what's going on. By the way, Sellers and Quine have realized this fact, and the whole book, the famous book of Wilgert van Ormond Quine, Word and Object, is Hegelian in its spirit. Quine, by the way, had admitted that in the 50s, later he did not. And the whole idea of word and object, that there is no dialectical reference to anything in the world without knowing the genus, is just a copy of the beginning of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So what I do also, as you realize, I tell the story of the recent development of philosophy in a totally new way, just because people do not tell us where they borrowed their ideas from. Sellers did, Quine did not later. So Hegel's famous criticism of Newtonianism mainly attacks the wrong assumption that we could embed or explain concepts or theories in the new physics of his time, which was electrochemistry and electromagnetism, into the old framework of mass point mechanics, which goes back to Descartes and Newton. Hegel thus shows, long before Marx and Engels, how naive mechanical materialism is. By the way, it was not before Mendeleev's system of elements, Helmholtz's detection of the ion, and the new atomic models that the worries of Hegel's reflection on the foundations of chemistry in his philosophy of nature were resolved. This is only for people who have looked at this book. So Hegel's most difficult concept, which is really difficult because most of his readers really do not get it, is the word idea, in German Idee. In English, idea is just a representation, a Vorstellung. In Hegel, the Idee translates Plato's idea tu agatu. And it means that we talk about a realization, an instantiation of the ideal concepts which we developed ideally or abstractly in our theories. So Plato's famous idea tu agatu, the idea of the good, is just the same as Plato's metexis, or Hegel's Vermittlung, mediation, between a generic ideal form and a real empirical Gestalt. The standard example is the application of geometrical forms. And this is, of course, already developed in Plato's philosophy. So if we understand all these things, we understand also that Hegel does not presuppose any entities behind the world, like world spirit, God, or reason in history with capital letters. All readers who read him that way, well, they can read whatever they want, but they cannot get a coherent picture of the text. Hegel rather reflects critically on sentences by which we talk about these matters. So he has the mode of mentioning people who talk about world, spirit, God, and reason, but he never seldom uses it. This is the reason, for example, why he says that God is known at first only by the three letters G-O-D, which is of course ironic. So he rather reflects critically on sentences on these things than claiming things about these things. The same holds for the distinction between mere appearances, essences, and Kant's ominous Ding an sich. So we should read Hegel when he talks about the being or the nothing as commenting on the use of to be and not to be. And the same holds for when he talks about essence, he talks about the word essential, real, true. And when he talks about appearance, he talks about apparently, seemingly, and so on. So if we do not translate him back to this reading, we miss what's going on. And Hegel does not share the idea of looking at the world from sideways on, as Kant still does. Kant still contrasts the fallible and finite knowledge of all of us pure mortals, to some divine absolute and infinite truth, to which only a God could have access. Hegel argues that Kant misunderstands the phrase an sich, per se, kat auto, or as such, just as the English philosophers and the English people usually misunderstand the definite article. The definite article is an abstracting device. It's not, especially in philosophy, but also in the sciences, it's not, at least not first of all, a device for simple denotation of already defined objects. This is the reason why in English, if you translate Hegel in English, they don't understand it, because they think that he hypothesizes the entities he talks about, the world, the spirit, and the reason, and so on. They are not able to use, as I call it, an urban language in which the definite article just topicalizes everything we want to talk about, even the word nothing. So it's only a matter of language competence to understand that the definite article in these more developed languages like ancient Greek and German, by the way, these definite article is an abstracting device, just as the word an sich or the word in principle and so on, because it marks that we talk generically about an abstract object, but this abstract object is constituted by that abstracting device. It's not presupposed as these more rural readings in the traditional English language and English philosophy are presupposing it. This urban and rural distinction also refers to the use of verbs in the active and passive voice. As you know, in the English language, you are not allowed to use passive voice anymore, which just shows that normally they expect that you should tell us what the things do and what they happened to act, as if you use the active voice, most of these active voice sentences were not only abstract sentences. So I think that is a big problem for reading Hegel, because most of the German readers also have a rural, not an urban reading of abstractions. So Hegel understands science as an institution of concept development, as I said. And philosophy now is speculative reflection on whole concepts or domains of the different sciences. By the way, when we today talk about philosophy, we are all in the heritage of Hegel, if we know it or not. Because since Fichte and Hegel, philosophy is speculative reflection on concepts in this holistic way, and not defining predicates in the numbers or in politics or whatever. So modern philosophy turns with Hegel into a kind of meta-knowledge or self-consciousness. There is no modern philosophy without this path through Fichte and Hegel. It is knowledge about the logic of objects and about the methods to establish and understand different forms of truth. As I was talking about the empirical way of truth, that means where we still have the subjective access to what can be perceived, and the standing sentences which we learn in encyclopedias or in school or in physics books or whatever. And if we understand that, then we understand that Hegel has a new understanding of the synthetic a priori with respect to Kant. When it comes to perception, and this is a modern debate, some of you might know John McDowell. When it comes to perception, Hegel hears again what the German word Wahrnehmung expresses. Wahrnehmung in German is better not to be translated into perception in English, because animals perceive things, but animals do not nehmen wahr. So the right translation would be apperception. Apperception is a perception which comes together with concepts. That means I can apperceive something only if I know what it is to apperceive. An animal doesn't have apperception. This shows that Hegel replaces the whole scheme of Kant's analysis by a system of new distinctions. Apperception is Wahrnehmung in the sense of conceptually mediated or conceptually determined. And as a result, and I come back to the modern debate in philosophy, Russell, Carnap, Ayer, and their critics, they thought that we can build up the world on the basis of sense data, this is just a dead-born child. As Wilfrid Sellers, Quine, McDowell, and Robert Brandon all have learned from the first chapter of the phenomenology of spirit. So modern philosophy has to get rid of this empiricism, logical positivism, logical atomism of the beginning of the 20th century. Empiricism and Kantianism still share the idée fixe of a foundational philosophical reflection on the concept of knowledge with Descartes, by the way. Descartes is the starting point for empiricism. But there is no immediate access to any content or referent in this world at all. All thoughts and all contents are mediated, as Wilfrid Sellers and Quine know. They are mediated by language or other forms of representation. Not to accept this is the failure of what I call romantic and naive intentionalism. Even in talks about speakers' meanings like H.P. Grice, by the way, I was a student of Grice in Berkeley. They think that we can start with immediate feelings and thoughts, but even those that allegedly never can be expressed properly, as Heinrich von Kleist says, or as Friedrich Schleiermacher more or less presupposes in his Religion of Feelings. Feelings are already conceptually informed, just like Wahrnehmung or apperception. So Hegel's attack on all these ideas of immediacy leads us to understand Kant's unity of our perception simply as coherence of using concept and language. And that's the only way we can understand this mystical way Kant talks about the unity of our perception. For Hegel, the general theme of philosophical reflection is, of course, self-conscious comprehension. We reach it not by subjective introspection, but only by topical logical analysis. Topical is the same as speculative. We reach it by looking at the whole and determine our place in the world. Therefore, it must be holistic. In all cases in which we need a sketch of a whole, it is obviously wrong to ask for a detailed map of local places. So the detailed maps are for the sciences, not for philosophy. Philosophy is speculative. It's, as I repeated, logical topography or geography. And if we do not grasp the difference, we do not even know how to use cartographies, for example. It's just the same. A photograph of a landscape is not usable if you want to orient yourself in the landscape. As I said, what Hegel calls the concept is a generic title for what I would like to call semantics. And he realizes that semantics is a matter of belongs to the system of language, and it doesn't belong to the system of using language. And this leads us to another point, which is absolutely crucial for understanding Hegel. That means the difference between logic, the logic of sentences, the logic of language in the sense of langage, because it's universal and international, and dialectics. Dialectics is the application of sentences, of langage, of languages also, to the real world in empirical statements or assertions or constative claims. They use, or we use, in such statements, the conceptual truths. The classical example is, of course, the use of geometrical forms when we project them on real empirical gestalts. Plato knows the problem. He calls it metaxis, mediation, and the same holds for Hegel. So dialectics, in my reading of Hegel, is the logic, the method of such projection. And as you can see in the case of geometrical forms, we need a measure for saying something is good enough, circular, it's straight enough, and so on. Dialectics now is the logic of parole. In modern terminology, people want to make a distinction between semantics and pragmatics, but they make it in the wrong way. They think pragmatics is, in Grice's terms, utterers meaning, but there is no utterers meaning at all. There might be a meaning of utterances, but that is this small difference make all the difference we need here. So dialectics is the meaning of utterances, semantics is the meaning of sentences. And this is an absolutely crucial distinction which was never developed before Hegel. Any theory and any learned sentence or rule expressing generic knowledge and hence semantical rules has exceptions. The laws of physics lie, says Nancy Cartwright, and she's right just because of that. All laws hold only ceteris paribus in principle, in general. Understanding general meaning of a concept an sich in Hegel's sense means to deal schematically with rules and differentially conditioned conceptual or default inferences. Grasping a concrete content of an empirical assertion or speech act means to apply the corresponding norms dialectically to the utterance in question, because we can never understand anything literally in the sense of sentences as rules, as default rules, because we always have to look at the context and situation and only make a choice of the inferences which belong to the system of the default inferences. And you will understand that a little bit better immediately. So dialectics is the logical or conceptual form of full comprehension of speech acts with their implicatures, metaphors, analogies, catachrestics, ironies, and so on. It is the form of using language in concrete dialogues, not a semantical form in this traditional sense on the level of the expressions. Semantics is the system of differentially conditioned default inferences for sentences as expressions, not for utterances or inner dialogues called thinking. By the way, this distinction is absolutely crucial even for informatics, even for automatic language processing, as my colleagues in Leipzig have developed in their default logic approach. As a practical competence of free comprehension, dialectic is a logic of dialogues that we can never fully express by sentences or rules. This, by the way, is the big difference between my approach and Bob Brandam's approach. Bob Brandam wants to develop dialectics, the non-monotonic dialectics, by rules and sentences, and I say this is just love's labor's lost. Especially important is a reasonable grasp of possible privations. Aristotle speaks of hysteresis. Hegel's ominous dialectical contradictions belong to this level of a dialectical pragmatism, as modern philosophy has it. I do not like the word. It is his way of expressing the fact that the form of using default norms and rules of semantic inference is non-monotonic. By the way, Brandon talks about this non-monotonicity the last 10 years all the time. In normal cases, and that's my example, my little grandson could conclude that he gets a healthy dog with 4 legs and so on if his parent promised him a dog as a pet for Christmas. If the dog would be sick, he would protest. Or if it were only a toy dog, he would protest also. Or the parents should have said so. Dialectical or pragmatic inference is non-monotonic, in the sense that in cases of privation, we infer from P and Q much less than from P. Fido is a dog, but he had a serious car accident. Therefore, we might be not entitled to expect that he still has 4 legs, eyesight, and so on. If I say that there is milk in the fridge, but it is there since weeks, you may not assume that it is still tasty milk. In fact, that is one of the examples of dialectics as a way of forms of understanding language in context. I call it sometimes a logic of the but. By the way, Frege thought that but just means and, but that was a big mistake. But is non-monotonic and. This is only for logicians and linguists. The schemes of a logic for sentences are monotonic. We can infer from the knowledge that the number is even or that it is prime much less than from the fact that it is even and prime. It's just the opposite than in the but case. Hegel's dialectical contradiction are therefore of the almost trivial following form. Our cat Emily, the three-legged cat, only seems to contradict the norm or rule that cats have 4 legs. Emily remains a cat after her accident. But to understand these things, we have to sublate, aufheben, the possible tangents between the default inferences and the context and its use. Now, of course, there is not only a diachronic dimension of language use, but also a diachronic dimension of language development. So there is a dimension of development of knowledge, which in my opinion is always the same as the development of language. And that leads us to the question, what is conceptual change, what is semantic change diachronically. I do not go into the details here. The only point I want to make is the following. Hegel, in his concept of, in his logic of the concept, already shows that the constructed linguistic rules, the constructed theories, the constructed semantic standard norms are justified not by induction, as Hume knew that it's impossible, not by deduction, as we say today in Hegel's terms, it's abduction, it's apagoge, but by abduction, as Charles Sanders Peirce later says. The idea of Charles Sanders Peirce, what abduction is, the best possible form of producing generic sentences in order to develop the relations and processes and forms of a domain is only, I repeat it, it's the best available way of conceptualize things. And that is the argument, and that's the only argument by which we can prove theories. So in fact, Charles Sanders Peirce and American pragmatism is just a copy of Hegel, and of course a copy of Hegel which was directly developed in reading his work. As you certainly know, Royce, William James and Peirce met together and read Hegel. They didn't understand it, but like many students and pupils, they understood it by developing the same ideas for themselves. And that is, at least in my opinion, the history of this insight. Therefore, all these people who praise Charles Sanders Peirce should continue and praise Hegel in this respect. So we can talk about conceptual change later. I only come back to the difference between empirical knowledge, historia, and scientia. I do not need many words for that, because the conceptual framework belongs to the semantics, history belongs to empirical statements, and they are, of course, of a different form. And here we can even call Hegel a structuralist if we want to. I do not go into these details. Even that these passages, if you have the handout about anti-foundational inferentialism, now understand themselves more or less already by the things I have said. Theories are frames or system of generic default inferences. Theoretical explanations are part. As such, they are always linguistic inventions. We can turn only some of such theories with good results into mathematical constructions. So there are much more theories in the world than only mathematical theories. And if you want to call Hegel's philosophy idealism, he himself calls it sometimes that way, then you should remember it just highlights the truism, the trivial fact that our theories are constructions. We overlook their linguistic characters only because we focus in their use on content, not on outer form. But if we focus on the outer form, we see immediately that they are constructions. So we tend to overlook the logical linguistic constitution of any content, especially when we talk about a correspondence between thought and the word. If you look at generic sentences, the talk of correspondence is even ridiculous. There is no correspondence at all. There is no correspondence of any law of our physical systems in the world. It would be ridiculous to assume that. So the only possibility to talk about correspondence are empirical statements and not standing sentences. And therefore, people are already confused when they talk about correspondence theory of truth. So many principles or axioms of such theories, well, the whole language we learn blindly. And we use them blindly, non-consciously, in inferences and argumentations. This is what Hegel realized. And this is the reason why we need philosophy in order to develop self-consciousness of what we know to do, how we know to do it blindly when we learn to use language and when we learn to use concepts. And philosophy is the reflection on what we do when we do that. And that, of course, holds for the sciences also. So in the sciences, we develop concept. In the philosophy, we learn what it means that we do that. In the sciences, we cooperate. In philosophy, we talk about the form of cooperation. And yeah. And when we come to the order of scientific themes and methods, then there are very interesting observations in more details, which I just want to mention shortly. Hegel sees that when we talk about life, then we have to know that the life processes as such, in principle, are chemical processes. But they are not only chemical processes, because they hang together in the whole process of one branch of one tree of life. And it would be therefore a big mistake to assume that we can reduce biology to chemistry and physics, even though it's true that in the processes themselves, they are chemical processes. So in a certain degree, biology and medicine have still the status of a mixture between technical know-how and empirical historia, just because of the historia of the tree of life. By the way, Hegel knows that from the grandfather of Charles Darwin. However, nobody would claim today that the limited range of exact laws makes these sciences less scientific. Nevertheless, there is still the claim in the world that every explanation of natural phenomena could be turned into a physical or chemical explanation in principle. Unfortunately, the use of the phrase in principle here has the form of a Radio Erivan joke, you know that communism is a good idea only in principle, but in fact and in reality it doesn't help. And the same holds for this in principle chemistry. The hope to reduce all true sciences and knowledge to physics is not even clear in its meaning or goal. Noam Chomsky, for example, had also seen that it does not help at all just to call our real science physics or natural science. Hence, we better follow Hegel, stick to the real forms and topics of knowledge, and argue from the perspective of today's system of our conceptual inferences. For Kant, nature is the epitome, the inbegriff of natural laws, the overall object of law like natural science. That is wrong. Schelling, and with him Hegel, protested against this identification of the whole world with the object of the natural sciences. Kant did not know what science is when we look from Hegel's point of view. On the other hand, Hegel admits, of course, as I said, that life an sich, in principle, is a chemical process, namely of metabolism. And so that was only, that was only a remark why it would be worthwhile to look at Hegel's philosophy of nature. Hegel's much contested philosophy of nature might suffer from problems of articulation. Its content is, however, much more rational and deep than his critics claim, if we reconstruct it with charity and understanding. The most extensive use of the words natura and physis is traditionally, as Heidegger had remarked also, coextensive with all being. I had said that in the beginning already. The whole world, which in turn coincides with Spinoza's more or less deistic or pantheistic God. Here, natura coincides with substantia, essentia, and deus. Hegel sees that this is much too broad. The nature of a thing is, in another use of the word, also its essence, as it stands in contrast to appearance. This distinction was elaborated in the logic of essence. The third main usage of nature is framed by the contrast of culture and nature, or spirit and nature. This distinction was elaborated in his real philosophy, in his philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit of the Encyclopaedia. So that shows how the system of Hegel looks like, and I think until today nobody understood the whole structure of that system. Spirit is the joint development of human culture, joint and universal, because langage and concept are international. Religion is only international. There is only one religion for Hegel. There is only one langage. And all the cultures copy each other and transpose the conceptual differences into their own cultures, even if it takes some time. And if America is still split from Europe, it takes even longer time. But else, all human beings copy all concepts. It is crucial to read this ominous word spirit not as a synonym for a metaphysical and transcendent God. It rather stands for the historical us in a generic form. We, humans. We create institutional practices. We create languages and sciences. They are part of it. Through them, we form our world. So Hegel is a universalist in all matters, in scientific matters, in religious matters, in social theory matters. Hegel's philosophy of spirit is a reflection on objective spirit of human culture. In our performative life, we take part in the presently given forms of objective spirit. In our performative life, we take part in culture and civilization, in the economy of the division of labor and good. Scientific developments and political self-rule are mediated by republican and democratic, sometimes monarchical structures and representations. A much smaller number of persons represent larger we groups. That's important and it's necessary, but they must be controlled. Already in his masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel understands the rites and celebrations of the religions as the phenomenological outer forms of representing absolute spirit. That means we celebrate ourselves when we celebrate religious rites. Objective spirit is the whole of institutions and forms of practices that are objectively given in our enactive behavior and actions. We refer to them as systems of forms in our sciences of spirit and culture. As a result, there is no contradiction between the insight that absolute being consists in performing forms in time by individual beings, and the insight that absolute truth is an ideal. Because the development of the community, the universal community of mankind, is of course an ideal. It's not yet reached. So we can now even explain the problem of the word absolute when we look at the difference between a truth which is relative to some claim and the truth of a performative doing. If I give you a promise, I make something new in the world. And if I claim that there is a rabbit out there, it's true only relative to the fact what you could see or what I can see. So Descartes already have realized this important difference. This is an important remark to the two meanings of absolute. Hegel sees that we comprehend scientific truths only when we see them as a human enterprise to develop a universal conceptual pre-knowledge for understanding languages as the instantiation of one language, the langage, of one concept, the conceptual distinctions and inferences, which are generically approved by knowing humans. Two last but most important remarks concern Hegel's reconstruction of knowledge, conscientia, that means conscience, but also consciousness, Gewissen, and freedom, liberty, as the two essential forms of leading a life as a full person. Like Plato and Leibniz, Hegel sees that the soul, the person, it's a monad, mirrors in herself all her personal relations to all other persons. Hence, I'm a full human person only insofar as I take active and proper part in the universe of all free persons who say the truth, keep promises and treatises, hence cooperate freely. By the way, Hegel's student Max Stirner had transposed this idea to Nietzsche. Nietzsche has the same idea. Hence, I'm a full human person only insofar I keep promises. That is what Nietzsche says. And keep treatises. Cooperate freely. That is Nietzsche and Hegel, but Nietzsche is directly influenced by it. And this is something we have to do despite all the risks that free riders and criminal minds can abuse this trust. That leads me back to Bob Brandon's marvelous book on Hegel's phenomenology, The Spirit of Trust is his title. However, the strife for security can undermine free cooperation, as Plato, Kant, and Hegel know quite well. So if I want to keep control about my secure place in the world, I tend to give up cooperation. They address the problem directly in their ethics. The famous prisoner's dilemma in modern decision and game theory is only a new way to represent the age-old problem. Plato describes it in his example of Gyges and in his examples of the need of a god who will take revenge against criminals. Hegel even writes sarcastically in the Phenomenology of Spirit that the risk of avoiding homo economicus without the spirit of trust belongs only to a spirited kingdom of animals, geistiges Tierreich. And he includes the homo nationalis into this reign of a mere animal rationale. Hegel sees that on the highest level of culture, we can animalize ourselves. We can turn ourselves from persons into mere animal subjects, which cannot be trusted, as Hegel also says. According to Hegel, it was Christianity which developed the idea of a free, conscientious person who takes up the insight of Socrates and Jesus that a full person has to take risks, and at least in principle prefers to be treated unjustly rather than treating others in an unjust way. Even though the corresponding real forms of practice slowly are becoming standards for the whole world, there are setbacks. In Hegel's structural analysis of world history, one such setback was already the return of the Byzantine state and religion to the form of an oriental reign. The Caesar became a rex, a holy basileus again. Families, tribes, and all forms of an economic cosa nostra became the central substatal forms of society. At least parts of the still intact republican traditions of Rome and Western Christianity were given up. And this is the point I want to stop my talk, and we can start now with the discussion. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Stekler. So, and we have a couple of questions. So, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Till Hermisch was the first one to raise a hand. No? So, then Max Stange. Mr. Stange?
No, thank you. This was no hand sign. This was a clap emoticon.
Oh, okay, so then I can see the hand raised by Prof. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe it is not a good question, but still, I'm curious. Do, according your reading of Hegel, it is correct to treat a philosopher as a master scientist, the one who could, who have more fundamental knowledge of things than scientists? Could philosopher somehow to not control, but probably give some kind of expertise of the scientific knowledge and researches? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think your question is absolutely important. And even though I didn't address it explicitly and directly, but this is not what I mean. So I think when it comes to the relation between philosophy after Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, who invented, if you want to, this idea of speculative reflection and developing self-consciousness of the sciences, scientific self-consciousness. In my reading, Hegel makes clear that there is not a competition between the better knowing philosopher and the scientists who work in the field on the topics. It sounds, if you read the philosophy of nature in Hegel, sometimes it sounds as if he wanted to know something better here. But I don't think that this is the case. He doesn't want to know things better than Berzelius or Berthollet or all these chemists of his time. He wants to make clear, however, that to do science, for example, to develop mathematics, is something else than to do philosophy of mathematics. In philosophy of mathematics, we need to look, as Wittgenstein saw, we need to look at the way we talk about mathematics. We have to look at language. We have to look at the science. We have to do something totally different to evaluate what it means that 2 years old already learn to count. And if the definition of numbers of Russell and Frege are totally mistaken, because Frege thought these small children's numbers are unscientific. And insofar, a philosopher would rather say what Husserl and Heidegger do. When we want to understand the sciences, please understand it in a division of labor where it is wrong to assume that the scientists know better than the normal people, because what they develop is just the knowledge of the normal people. And that is another point of view than to compete with the scientists. The same holds for the making a distinction between scientific knowledge on one side and scientific ideologies on the other side. So the philosopher is criticizing scientific ideologies, but he is not criticizing the working scientists, only if they make mistakes. By the way, they make sometimes mistakes. I was in Berkeley when they celebrated the 80th birthday of Alfred Tarski. Quine was there and other people. Alfred Tarski, a great logician. But the whole enterprise of an axiomatic set theory and an axiomatic model theory is, in a certain sense, philosophically mistaken. It's not mathematically wrong. And that is only a small remark how I would like to read these things. But you are right, it's not easy to understand that somebody who does a cartography is somebody else than somebody who takes the photographs of small landscapes. This is another enterprise, using another language or using other methods, and it helps to orient ourselves in another way than when we use the, as I call it, sachorientierte, matter or object-oriented sciences. And I totally agree, it's difficult to understand that. And it's even more difficult to understand that you do not need a universal mind like Leibniz, who allegedly knew everything in his time about the sciences, which I totally deny. That is not right. But we need a little bit knowledge about everything. Insofar, philosophers need, of course, having an overview about at least the outskirts of the sciences. Yeah.
So, any more questions? Yeah, so there is a question in the chat. So the question is whether the world is historical. So, and from Hegel's point of view, does logic arise with language, or does it in any sense precede language?
Dennis, please repeat. I didn't understand you.
Yeah,
sorry.
So there are two questions basically. So is world historical? So can you hear me?
Yes, and I hear you, but what is the historical part?
So how the question is just formulated, it's in the chat. You may see it also if you open this section of chat.
Yeah.
So
if you don't mind, I will read the question for Pirmin.
Yeah.
Okay, the question is from Anna something, because I don't speak Russian, and the question goes as the following. Does Hegel recognize the existence of logical truths as eternal, formal, and independent of the conceptual content of our language? And there's a second question. Or is logic historical for him, just as the concepts in which we describe the worlds are historical. From Hegel's point of view, does logic arise with language, or does it in any sense precede language?
Oh, I see. I didn't see the chat. Okay. Well, as you have realized, this claim that the standard distinction between analytic and logical and synthetic a priori sentences must be rearranged. The idea that there is a logic in the old sense of mathematical logic as the backbone structure of logical definitions of more complex sentences like in Tractatus or like in Frege is not the interesting point of logic at all. So Fregean modern analytical philosophy, as far as they do logic, do mathematical logic, and this logic holds only for mathematics. It doesn't hold for the logic of language and using language. This is just claims, of course, that the linguistic turn doesn't have started yet, even though they talk all the time about that. The idea that logic is eternal is just the same as mathematics is eternal. And mathematics is, of course, eternal. That was exactly what I said. It's eternal just because we defined mathematics as a schematic system of truth, and therefore it's eternal. So mathematics is eternal. But the interesting point is that mathematics has application in the real world. And therefore, what we defined in mathematics as truths are not defined mathematically, but by looking and working with countable things and with geometrical forms, which are, of course, are represented not only by words, but also by gestalts. And in this practice, of course, the eternity of the conceptual rules of geometry change. They are not eternal all over the time, but only in the domain and realm of their reasonable use. So the reasonable use for Euclidean geometry are rectangular solids. That means solid bodies. They are not space-time as we know in the meantime. So the eternity, the infinity of the standing sentences is in fact, and I omitted that passage, is in fact limited to the time we use this framework in representing things, matters in the world. So there is, of course, a history even of the applied mathematics, and it's a history of the applied logical concepts of our theories. So the basic point is that we have to make a distinction between utterances where there is an implicit datical reference to the speaker, this and there, here and now, and so on, where we refer to singular things, and standing sentences. They are eternal from their form, of course. And so we need a new distinction between what people call logic and what people call empirical. By the way, the everyday talk of logic is so broad as to incorporate all these things I was talking about. Because of course it's logical that if you want to get out of a circle, you have to cross the circle line. But that is not formal logic at all, it's geometry. So people say it's logic. And with respect to logic, I would say what I did is just tell you we have to need a new understanding of the eternity of logic and the infinity of these standing sentences. And that was in fact the point I was making. Another point, of course, is the distinction between using causal explanations in a causa efficiens and talking about great historical facts, like the fact that there was a Big Bang, or the fact that life emerged on Earth and things like that. That was a point I was talking about also. The big historical facts are of a different kind than empirical claims, but and they are also of a different kind than logical or conceptual or semantical rules, but they enter the semantics by these big presuppositions of the history of the facts we talk about. So, in fact, I really disagree with a kind of everyday and learned or traditioned way of looking at logic and empirical statements. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mr. Emrich, so are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you. My question concerns the question of eternal truth as well, but in a different sense.
Could you please speak a little louder?
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is concerns the idea of eternal truth as well, but I would like to start with a distinction you made. You distinguished between truth in the sense of the empirical science, like something is the case, and truth in the sense of, as I understood it, of by doing so. Yeah. I'm not sure if I did understand the distinction properly, but as far as I understood your last answer, it seems to me that the eternal, the eternality, or the fact that logic is eternal, yeah, by definition, is something that is a truth by doing so, because we handle logic this way. Maybe you can enlighten me about this a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah, well, in Hegel, of course, when I look at how he uses the word eternal, ewig, the word infinity, and so on, is always used ironically. So it's always used in the way, well, if I have many things, if I have many people who died, then we say infinitely many people died. And so it's only an exaggeration when we talk about the word eternal and infinite and so on and so on. Only in mathematics there is a real use of infinite. That is the analysis of Hegel. But when it comes to your question, the difference between a finite statement is, as I said, there is a rabbit over there. This is a finite statement, but if I have an if-then sentence, if there is a rabbit over there, then the rabbit has 4 legs. The if-then sentence is not assumed as either there is no rabbit not right now here, or there it has 4 legs as a constative, but it's meant as a generic rule. And if it's meant as a generic rule, then of course it's eternal in this way of commenting on it. So the difference is a very simple difference. A rule is eternal and an empirical statement is not. Of course, modern logicians get everything confused. That is another story when they understand the if-then not as a rule, but as a constative. Yeah.
Let's say the principle of contradiction is considered to be eternal for obvious reasons, because if we don't apply to it, we may just say nothing. In which way is it internal? Is it internal because of the way we are acting, or is it eternal in a different sense? Because you could say it is eternal, but there is, but it is conditioned by something that we don't have control of. Like maybe sometimes we don't know, it won't be true. because whatever.
Well, what does the principle of contradiction says? Well, the principle of contradiction says that it's impossible to go north and south at the same time. And it's impossible to make a distinction between A and B together if the one makes the distinction and the other confuses A and B. So the principle of contradiction is only the principle, the idea, that if we want to make distinctions together, we should make it coherent. But it is not at all something which is a truth on the level of sentences or utterances. Neither one. Just because on the level of sentences, of course, we want to have the default inferences coherent. But we will never succeed because we will need the context, because we have too less words for that. Therefore, all the words in our languages have many meanings depending on the context. But even worse, when we want to understand each other in parole, in language used, of course we want to agree. We want to produce joint action by joint distinction. But we know that it doesn't work. We know that the generic knowledge which we have learned do not coincide if I have two people. So we have to work hard to figure out what is the topic, what is the concept we talk about, what is the way we use the languages, how do we make the distinctions, what are the default inferences, how do they have to apply here. So that is the idea of Hegel. We make, by going along in praxis, in the parole, dialectically, the pre-given incoherences coherent. It's pre-given, it's inconsistent from the start, not because we have learned inconsistent sentences, but because the use of it must be adjusted to the context. And insofar, this abstract way of talking of Aristotle about these things is just the same mistake as Frege, because the logic of Aristotle is mathematical. He's just working with geometrical inclusions of circles in other circles. That is all of he's doing. And there, of course, I have a principle of non-contradiction artificially introduced into mathematics. Mathematics is consistent. That is a very nice feature of mathematics. But this very nice feature of mathematics is constructed by us, and to assume that in using it in the real world, we do not lose this nice property is naive to its bones. And that's exactly the insight of the Hegelian understanding of language, concept, and science.
Thank you.
Yeah, so any more questions, please? Yeah, Alexander?
Can you hear me from this position, Dr. Stekeler?
Yeah, very good.
Okay, I will be answering loud. So thank you for your talk. And my question for you've made a distinction between nature and spirit. As you said, nature is the domain of matter and processes which exist without any influence of human being.
Yeah.
And yeah, on the other hand, we have spirit. This is a domain of theoretical entities, rules, and any norms, and so on, which exist thanks to human beings, of course. I would like to offer a different point of view the point of view Stoic philosophers.
Yeah.
According to Stoic philosophy, there is a God, and it forms everything. It is a pneuma, so that's why we can say that there is any difference between, for example, a stone, a cat, a tree, a human being. So, thanks to this position, there is no gap between animate and inanimate nature. I guess there is a piece of plausible to take it this point of view into account. How do you think? Should we take it into account, and is it really a promising position point of view or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think your question is great, even though it leads us to a special debate, which I have put a little bit into a bracket. I was addressing it by the criticism of the idea of looking at the world from sideways on, or from a view of nowhere. I mentioned John McDowell, and I could mention Thomas Nagel, just to name a couple of names. The idea of the Stoic point of view of a speculative, and here I use it in the same sense, from a very high point of view, looking at the whole world, not making this distinction between the world of action and language and the world of trees, animals, and so on. We can, in fact, produce a point of view like that, and we produce it all the time, sometimes. The problem is that we shouldn't do it, at least not always. The problem is that if we talk that way, as if we could look at the world from a God's eye point of view, we overlook not only the difference between past, present, and future, we also overlook the enormous difference between living a life in the possibilities produced by text, language, concepts, and living a life in, as Nietzsche says, bound to the stick of the present. That means in active behavior of animals, or in causa efficiens of happening things in the non-animated world. So Stoicism is an interesting point of view from sideways on, and it is silently still the point of view of Immanuel Kant. And until Kant, Stoicistic point of views onto the world were dominant, even in Spinoza and even in Leibniz, despite some differences. And in fact, and therefore your question is very interesting, in fact, we have to attack this point of view as an ideology which, or as a wrong picture of the world, just because the basic distinctions between the different forms of life, between animals, plants, stones, and humans, get abstracted in this point of view. But even more so, the big difference between past, present, and future, as I said. So in a certain sense, the Stoic point of view of the world is a standing sentence point of view. They do not make a distinction between the empirical world and the eternal world. So they do not even understand and follow the idea of making this distinction in Heraclitus and Parmenides, at least in my reading of the history of philosophy, because Heraclitus, Parmenides, Socrates, and Plato make that distinction. So they are the first to think in the way I tried to reconstruct Hegel as a reader of Parmenides, Heraclitus, Plato, and these people. And Stoicism is just it's just the opposite in a certain sense. It's this idea that we can look at the world sub specie aeternitatis. Still, Wittgenstein is a Stoicist in his Tractatus. And I think we have to start again to make these distinctions. Well, another point is, of course, when it comes to understanding what truth is, then it's interesting that the classical, I would call it transcendent way of looking at things start with true sentences, not even making the distinctions between standing sentences and empirical sentences, whereas a more a subtle, or let us say a more down to earth, however you put it and however you look on it, access is the Hegelian to say, do not start with truth, start with distinctions. And if you start with distinctions, making differences, and if you start with making differences, then evaluate which differences have to be made and which differences should not be made, because we should and must identify joint differentiations. And joint differentiations presuppose that I am able to evaluate equivalences. So if we start with differences, then truth, of course, cannot be anything else than transsubjective making differences. And objectivity is this transsubjectivity which shows in the success of making differences together. With this point of view, all the myth of a truth from a perspective of a God who is not a human being, but standing outside space and time, as the patristic people say, jenseits von Raum und Zeit. This is just flatus vocis. It's just a kind of verbal expression which is without any meaning. There is nothing which can look onto the future as if it were a history. This is just impossible. History is of the form that we cannot change it, but the future is not of the form that we cannot change it. The future is modal, it's not settled, as Noel Belknap says. So the Stoic God, or the Stoic point of view of looking at the world, identifying nature with all the world, and identifying and not making the distinction between humans and animals, is of course still a present ideology, as you know, when you look at the way the natural sciences talk about human beings today, because they are just animals with a little bit better intelligence than other animals. Of course, we can do so. We can deny or refuse to make important differences. Of course, we can do that, but it's not really sensible.
Yeah, if no one has a question, then I would like to ask you one. So I want to start from the metaphysical domain. So according to your reading of Hegel, and so you yourself claim that such a position is true. So there are two components to any sound metaphysical theory, or any semantic and so on. So on the one hand, we have this realist part, which says that there is this hardcore outside world and it doesn't depend in any way on the human mind or humanity as a whole. And on the other hand, there is this subjective component, which includes kind of intentionality, which includes pragmatic aspect and so on. And well, combined together, at least at the first glance, they give us some kind of Cartesian perspective that there are two substances and they do not kind of, so they just stand apart and do not interfere with each other, but somehow there is this pre-established harmony. And so, as I understand it, your point is exactly that Hegel just refuses such point of view, and he somehow combines those two perspectives. And you elaborate with the term transsubjective or objective. And well, I realize that it's a big question which requires, I don't know, dozens of big books to be answered, at least prima facie. But still, could you please elaborate a little bit more on this topic? So how do these two standpoints combine, or how can they be combined so that we wouldn't get into this Cartesian trap?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm able to answer all your question, Dennis. But the first attempt is the following. As I said, there is an idea fix to that knowledge, human knowledge, should be defined as true statements, however, standing sentences or empirical sentences, that are not only true, but certain. So the idea fix of certainty and the idea fix of foundationalism and transcendental arguments is something we have as a Cartesian tradition, and Kant is still in this tradition. Empiricism is, of course, an attempt to say, what are the basis of our knowledge? And they start with the senses and with the inactive perceptions, and then they want to build up bundles of qualitative perceptions, and they define objects by that, and so on and so on. And the Hegelian approach is totally different in a certain sense, because this transcendental or half-transcendental empirical idea of the post-Cartesian tradition overlooks the fact that certainty is not part of the concept of truth, and not at all. And certainty is a subjective feature, so all these people who have this idea of certainty, they are subjectivists. He calls them subjective idealists. And he even includes Fichte to these subjective idealists. So he would say, all these people who try to base fixed rock-bottom truth on transcendental arguments, like Karl Otto Apel and all these kinds of people in this post-Kantian tradition and post-Cartesian tradition, they are mistaken. Because the transcendental presuppositions are relative to what we have learned. And it's not absolute. There is no absoluteness at all. There is no immediacy to thoughts at all. So we swim more or less on the surface of traditions, and to assume that we can reconstruct fixed pillars for a stable house, this is our, of course, metaphors, is a mistaken view of what knowledge is. Well, I agree that there is a problem now, because when Hegel says sometimes man kann auch falsch wissen, you can know something wrongly. But this is in my opinion, a very deep and interesting point of view, because it says the following. Now, please take a little bit of time. I take a little bit of time to make it clear. And I do not talk about truth now, but about intention. I can have an intention to do something, like, for example, to help my neighbor this afternoon. And I can have this intention without starting to help her. But if at 2 o'clock in this afternoon, I do something else, then I have turned my intention right now into a mere wish. A wish is something where I describe myself as having done it. An intention is an intention in action only if I do it. So, and the reason why I tell this story is the following. When I say there is milk in the fridge, and you ask me if I know it, then I say, yes, I know it, I have tested it. Then, of course, I did what I could. But if it turns out that this milk is poisonous and that we both die and the coroner sees that we died and my sentence, it was milk in the fridge, was wrong, then, of course, just like in the case of the intention, after that, we have to rephrase it and say, we only thought there is milk in the fridge. But this doesn't mean that right now I should say, no, I only think there is milk in the fridge. So the present distinction between knowledge and not knowledge, and the evaluated distinction between knowledge and not knowledge after that are not the same. So Hegel would say the difference between knowledge, not knowing, and belief are present distinction. And if you look from an eternal point of view, as the Kantians and all these certaintists want to, they do not realize that they have already the wrong point of view. They look on the world, on the real world of truth, from an ideal geometrical point of view, and they run into the same problem as if Hume or Protagoras could say, well, in the real world, there are no pure circles and pure geometrical straight lines, and therefore whole geometry is wrong, and therefore we can be skeptical, and therefore everything is wrong here. And Hegel sees that this is the wrong move, and the right move would be to understand that ideal truth is an ideal like the eidos, and when it's used in the real world, we have to use it properly in a finite setting and not in an infinite setting. So infinite points of views are only formal, verbal, and so on and so on. That is very nice, but they are not real truth. Real truth is the real application of this ideal form, and we have to accept the difference between reality and ideality of truth. And transcendental analysis and empirical analysis do not even grasp this difference. So I hope I have said at least a little bit to your question.
Yeah, sure, certainly. But if I may then put it very crude, so what do you think? Is Hegel a kind of realist or constructivist, or something in between, or just like, yeah, it is very crude.
Did I understand it? A realist or?
Constructivist.
Yes.
Within this modern dichotomy.
Yeah. Look, this question is too general, because when he says that he is an objective idealist, he would say, well, please call me objective idealist or absolute idealist. He just wants to say the theories are constructed. So what we learn in school are constructed. The language of mathematics is constructed. All these things which we learn are constructed. But this doesn't mean, because there is only one word and not many words, constructed words, this doesn't mean that the world and reality and truth is constructed, because the relation to the world is the use of the constructed default inferences of the theories. And so since the theories are constructed, but their use into real empirical world in space and time is a real interaction between us and the world, it would be ridiculous to say that the world is constructed. So only from the point of view of the wrong idea that the world is my world, which is a very nice wrong sentence, the wrongest sentence in the Tractatus of Wittgenstein, which is, of course, the basic idea of Cartesianism, that the access to the world is through my senses and my imaginations and so on and so on. And Hegel says, well, my imaginations exist only when I presuppose already what I have learned. There is no direct access, and forget it to construct the world as my world, because my world is only a small part of the world. So even though for me my world is everything, that's true, but when it comes to reality and to objectivity, I have to transcend my world and to talk to you, for example. And if I do not start to talk to you, I cannot even understand what I do when I talk to myself. So for Hegel, with respect to this possibility of transsubjective distinction, the world is real. And it's not, as in the Kantian way, space and time are only forms of intuition, of my intuition. That is subjective idealism. Space and time are the relation of all the things in the real world, including me and you. So space and time is not only a relation to me, but a relation of all things to all other things. And that is a very deep insight. So Kant starts, if you read the Transcendental Aesthetics, which I very often call the worst book in philosophy on earth, it starts just with a very wrong idea what space and time is. It relates the spatial and temporal order only to the subject, as if the world would be my world ordered by my space and time orderings. That is Humeanism through and through. And the interesting point is that Hume doesn't have any access to possibilities, to language, to meanings. He describes cognition as if it was an inactive reaction of animals. The only difference of Kant is he introduces some transcendental, mystical forms of conceptual proceedings. So Kant is a mixture between Hume and Locke in a certain sense. Of course, this is over formulating the difference. I want to do that actively in order to get rid of this standing in awe of the deep Kant, only to give you some chances to get rid of this tradition. Of course, some people would say, well, you can read Kant in a better way. I do not mind, we can.
Thank you. So, are there any more questions? Yeah, I can see anything. So, and then I would like to ask you one last question. There's no more. Yeah, it concerns Hegel's philosophy of right. So, yeah, recently we have published your commentary book on this Hegel's work, and I'd like to ask you the following question. So, there is this long-standing debate whether Hegel was a kind of a communitarian or rather some sort of liberal thinker. And in order to make Hegel's position on this question a little bit more precisely, so I'd like to mention the name Philip Fichte. So this author recently, well, not so recently, but anyway, within last 30 years, he developed a theory of Republican freedom, where he construes this, or rather reconstrues the notion of freedom not. So he parts with the classical liberal notion of freedom as non-interference, and instead of this, he proposes this notion of freedom as non-domination. So the second notion presupposes that there is a certain room within this lawful space that each person has some general rights that secure his or her personal freedom, so that no person, no institution, no organization, well, even no not a government, would be able to somehow coerce or somehow put this person into a position of being dominated, which excludes, of course, the realm of public deliberation when a person acknowledges that such and such measures that are endowed for the person from the outside are reasonable, so that, for instance, when someone has a job, this person cannot be just fired without any reason, just on arbitrary decision of the job owner. Yes, whereas this opposite conception of freedom as non-interference, well, it tacitly allows such a possibility. So, yeah, it's basically a huge question, but what would you say about Hegelian position within this problem, within this domain?
Yes, thank you, Dennis. Well, your question concerns the whole idea of a social and state theory. That means the whole domain of law, morals, sociality, and so on. And of course, it's impossible to answer all of it. But there are, I want to separate 2 points. The first is the way we talk about these things when you use, for example, the word communitarianism or communitarian point of views. And if I start with that idea, then for me, the best book on this problem is Ferdinand Tönnies' Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, Community and Society. Because even though the book is written in an old-fashioned style, Tönnies makes clear that living together needs at its base communitarian, as we call it, Gemeinschaftlichkeit, at its basis in the families and in the friendships of the neighbors, because there we have informal ways of living together. And these informal ways of living together are crucial for developing persons, because we learn the morality of direct interaction with our fellow children, with my sisters and brothers and friends and so on. And we need that. But then a thinker would be a communitarianist when he would think that we can organize larger scale cooperations, like, for example, the working system or the law system in a society with more than 7 people or 10 of a small family, to be ironical, in the same way. So it might be that the social democrat Tönnies was naive when he criticized the Gesellschaft as this large youth group of people who have to cooperate in different ways, namely economically and so on, using the possibility that the other people are just abusing me or that they are free riders, as I said in the end of my talk. Now, the point is that when I ridiculed the idea of communism, there was a small hint to the fact that as long as the idea of communism is the idea, at least in the late Marx, that we just have to believe that people want to cooperate, and then when they do it the right way, we do not need any power or might or control or law or state. If they have enough to eat and if they cooperate, then they work when they want to, and or else they go fishing, as you know in this famous passage. This doesn't work. And Hegel never thought that it could work like that. Therefore, he's not a communitarianism, he's not a communist. But long before Marx, he realized that the other extreme, the idea that we need only a state-ordered economical system, keeping up the rules of property, and then things go well as Adam Smith thought, because everybody is rational, he is an homo economicus, working for his own interest, and he's clever enough not to make war with the others, but to work with them together as long as he profits from it. And then everything will be fine. That is, as you know, the wealth of nation idea. And Hegel denies that. And Hegel says this is wrong because, and he saw that because too many people fall out of the system and do not have the chance to survive. And therefore it was Hegel and not Marx. Marx was only copying that to see that we need schemes to stop unemployment, for example, because in the new society, the world is already split up into private properties. And if you do not have a property, a land for working as a farmer for yourself, you will not survive if you do not get into the working force of division of labor. And therefore, Hegel, not the Marxist, but social democrat Marxist like Keynes, saw that the biggest problem of the modern world is full employment. And of course, that was always an argument of the communists, but they wanted to solve it by a strong state and just opposing the Marxian ideas of a communitarist system. This is, of course, the development of Lenin. And in the Hegelian point of view, he would say we need the state, of course. So it would be utopian to have a communitarian communism, as Marx thought. But he would also deny the idea of a state-structured capitalism without a state-organized division of labor. And state means that we have to admit that we need Republican powers. So we cannot just stick on democratic consensus as some naive Marxists like Habermas still think. But on the other hand, we need control of the state. And insofar, I think it's absolutely modern, the whole debate about the relative need of state power and the relative good sense of a property-based way of living a free life, and not an absolute liberalist point of view, which is still Smithsonian, as in the US on the right side. So in a certain sense, sometimes I say ironically, the whole development of social democracy owes much more to the Hegelian philosophy of law, as people know. By the way, this is even true if you look at the people who developed the ideas of social democracy in Germany, because they were all readers of Marx and Hegel, not only of Marx. And this is very important for understanding history. So in fact, it doesn't make sense to say there is an either-or between communitarianism and liberalism. There is a need of reconcile these much too extreme positions. And Hegel is not a liberalist. He is a Republican in a certain sense, but he is a Republican and a constitutionalist in a sense which for today's understanding of democracy seems outdated because he accepted the need of a monarch. But what we need also here, and I think it's always very difficult to understand the difference in time, because at his time, at the time of the restitution of the European monarchies in all the post-Napoleonic countries, from Belgium to the Netherlands, which were never monarchies, especially not the Netherlands. This is just a reaction on the French Revolution. The only country which didn't go that way was Switzerland, and that has a very special history. So in his time, nobody thought that you can have republican structures without a monarchy. And today, of course, we think that it is possible, but it is really difficult to have a change of perspective how the world looked like in other times. And in those times, it looked like as if a democracy is a bad idea, because democracies in those days were democracies of the ancient Greek type, and they were communitarian. And of course, they knew what the problem of communitarianism is in those days. It's the rule of a majority, and it's only possible if you have an aristocratic rule of a majority, like in Sparta or in Athens, and the slaves and the immigrants were just citizens of second order, and they didn't have any power. And insofar, it's not a good idea to use Athens as a good idea, as a paradigm for democracy. And the possibility of a democratic republic was, and that it's a good idea, was not yet even developed in the US, because the US was not a democracy in those days at all. Just read people from that time, and then you will see that. Before the Civil War, we didn't have a party system in the US, and the party system, which was developed in Switzerland in the war, also in the Civil War in Switzerland, the so-called Sonderbundskrieg. Only after that, a democratic party developed, which meant that if the other party won, the one party accepted that. And this is a very new development, and in only a handful of countries today really practice that. And that means that a democratic republic is a problem, as we see in the world. And in so far, if we are fair with that analysis of Hegel and Marx and Engels, which were very good in that, in understanding what's going on, but made from some understandable point of view different decisions. When we look at this history, we will understand even our present days better. So I always try to advertise that it's worthwhile to change the perspective and try to look or try to tell a story how the world might have looked from their point of view, before we just say, well, what Hegel says about monarchy is bullshit, because he thought that it's a good idea to have a monarchy where the monarch is just a heritage monarchy. But of course, that was solved the problem of fighting for the successions, which of course was one of the reasons why the heritage monarchy was a good idea, because after the death of the monarch, you would have civil wars and things like that. So I would always recommend this hard work of trying to understand the perspective of the time, and not only our perspective on the sentences produced by these writers. And that is, in my opinion, a work which at first starts, of course, with the sentences these writers produce, but then have to look that the words might have changed, the context of the self-understood truths have changed, the meaning have changed, therefore. And we have to reconstruct these things. If we don't do that, we only talk superficially. We write essays with a couple of citations, and then it's our thoughts added to these citations, but that is not the right way to do so. So translating old texts is a more complicated work, in my opinion, than most people think. And that holds for philosophy as well as for all the Geisteswissenschaften, all the sciences of spirit, in my opinion. The interesting point of view, I have a debate with many people who think, well, why don't you say that one has just to take the position of these other people? But how do you do that? You cannot get out of your time or your skin. That was an insight of Leibniz. A monad cannot get out of my skin and look at myself from outside. The only thing is that we can reconstruct fictitious dialogues, of course, that takes place in a possible world of talking and not in the real world. We cannot travel into the past, and I cannot look into your head and things like that. And therefore, it's a very nice idea to talk about perspective change, the change of perspectives, but it is really hard work to do it because I always have to accept that it's my idea of the perspective change. Of course, it's my story about Hegel or about Plato. Of course, it is. But I try to reconstruct different equivalence relations than normal people or traditional people who read Plato as an idealist or whatever, and read Hegel as an idealist or as a communitarist. I just want to say that is the task of modern philosophy and modern science of spirit, to develop transperspectival stories. And if we don't do that, we remain limited in our small traditions of tribal, national prejudices, or even scientific prejudices of how history is told by people who had canonized it. In each country different, as we know.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there seems to be no more questions, so yes, we have to thank you for your magnificent talk, and yeah, I think that by this we shall finish our meeting for today. So, Professor Stekeler, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you here. And well, unless there are some more questions, I suggest that we then finish.
So thank you a lot for the organizing, Dennis. It was very nice. And I hope you enjoyed it also a little bit, even though I know it was a huge tour de force, but I just wanted to give you some outlines or insight into the basic ideas. So thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
care. Do swidania.
Do swidania.
Всего доброго.